If you have a Bible and you want to follow along today, we are going to be in Luke chapter 15. In fact, we're going to be in Luke 15 for the next month. So if you come here every week, including our Christmas experience, you'll never have to wonder where to turn your Bible. It'll be Luke 15 every single time. If you don't have a Bible, no worries. Scripture will be on the screen. You can follow along on there. Let me set it up like this. How many of you have ever seen Lord of the Rings? Show of hands. Show of hands. Show of hands. If you've not seen Lord of the Rings, your life is sad. Okay, so you need to go home and you need to watch. You need to take like a weekend and watch, because it'll take about that long to watch. And you need to watch it. Don't watch The Hobbit. The Hobbit was horrible. Watch Lord of the Rings. It's awesome. So in Lord of the Rings, there's this character. His name is Smithfield. He has not very much hair, kind of like me, except less. He has 6 teeth. He looks really kind of weird, skinny, unhealthy looking, and he's got very unnaturally large eyes. So Smithfield, in his little quest in Lord of the Rings, has had something taken from him many, many years ago, and it was what he affectionately refers to as the precious. And it's this ring. In fact, if you've never seen Lord of the Rings, this is spoiler alert. But his precious is ultimately the ring of power. And he had it stolen by nasty tricks and hobbitses. And so what Smeagol wants to do is he goes and he looks for the ring. He wants to get it back, so he tracks down the nasty tricksy hobbitses, and he attaches himself to them and acts like their friend. But in reality, all he wants is the ring. So he goes on this journey with these hobbits because he wants the ring back. That's literally his sole desire, is to get back the precious and take it back from me. That's what he wants. He wants it so bad that he ultimately bites off the guy's finger, gets the ring, and he finally gets his precious, but he does so falling into a boiling lake of lava and dissolves to death. And the ring dissolves too, and everything is better. What was the point of that weird little story about Smithfield and his precious? Here's the point in that. You can tell by the diligence of the pursuit of the ring that Smeagol Gollum values the ring. He places a very high priority on the ring, so he seeks it, so he pursues it. The point in that is this: we can always tell the things that we value by the things that we pursue. We can always tell the things that we value by the things that we seek after, that we devote our lives to acquiring, or devote our lives to finding. Therefore, I believe it's very, very important for us to figure out whether or not the things we're seeking, the things that we value, are in fact the most valuable things, which may beg the question, well, how do I determine what is most valuable? You answer this question. It'll pop up on the screen. Do I seek what God seeks? Do I seek what God seeks? You might say, well, why does that matter? Because if what we seek is what is valuable, then what God seeks, what God pursues, is things that have ultimate value. And so if we want to pursue things that have ultimate value, then we have to be pursuing what God is pursuing. So what we're going to read here in Scripture today is going to give us an idea of what God seeks. But let me kind of preface it with this. The primary thing that God seeks is God's glory. That's the primary thing that God seeks. And you might say, well, that sounds a little egocentric to me. But it's actually not, see, because God knows that in order for us to experience His best, that only happens when we seek His glory. And so it's not unloving of God. It's not like egocentric of God or narcissistic for God to seek His glory. It's actually the best thing that can happen for us, because when God is glorified, we are actually satisfied. So the primary thing that God seeks is His glory. But the story we're going to read today is going to give us an idea of kind of what that looks like in terms of what God might practically seek. That actually, in my opinion, leads to Him being glorified probably more than anything else. So, here we go. This story that we read is in Luke chapter 15. It's called a parable. A parable is very simply a story that teaches a spiritual truth. So, here we go. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. Pause here. This is important for understanding the story. The man in the story represents God. The 2 sons represent the 2 different groups that Jesus would have been talking to at this time. The first group, represented by the younger son, is what culture considered to be sinners. These were people who were obviously rebellious against God. They obviously did things that God did not approve of, that God hated, that God would not have wanted them to do. So that's going to be represented by the story of the younger son. The second son, the older son, represented the religious leaders. of Israel. These were the guys, they did everything right. They went to church all the time. They gave, they served, they tried their best to keep all the laws. These were the guys that parents would have said to their children, be like those guys. This group of people were the outwardly religious, but both of them, the obviously rebellious and the outwardly religious, actually are not too terribly different, and we'll find that out as we go along here in the story. Verse 12, the younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. Now, how many of y'all have kids? I do not. I have dogs. Kids. Cool. How many of y'all would think it was awesome if your child came up and said, Mom and Dad, can you go ahead and kick the bucket so I can collect on your life insurance? Well, like, how many of y'all think that would be awesome? Probably not. You're probably thinking, I will now write you out of my will and I'll just cancel my life insurance policy so that if I die, you can be poor and be left with all my debt. And that's what we'll do. And the point is this is not like a loving thing for a child to say to a dad. It's like, Dad, please go ahead and die. And so in the context of this story, with the man representing God and the younger son representing sinners, this is a lot of times, or really, this is a representation of what happens when we choose to run from God. Much like the younger son is trying to disown his dad, get away from his dad so he can go do his own things. Many times, when we are on the other side of salvation, when we're not saved, when we're running from God, it's like telling God, God, I wish you were dead so you were not involved in my life. I want to do what I want to do, and I don't want you to be involved. So then this happens, and this is going to be really interesting, especially later on. So he, the dad, divided his property between them. In other words, okay, you don't want me involved? Fine, here's your half. Then he gives twice as much to the older son. And so this is important. The dad here has completely dispersed his estate. 2/3 went to the older son, 1/3 went to the younger son, and they can do whatever they want with it. That's going to be really important in regards to the older son later. So, we see the motives of the younger son revealed here, verse 13. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for Las Vegas, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. He went and did whatever he wanted to do. In fact, this is the reason why he wanted the money in the first place. He was tired of living under Dad's thumb. He was tired of doing what his dad wanted him to do, and he's like, okay, great. Now I have cash. Now I can go and do my thing. And so he goes and does everything his dad wouldn't want him to do. He hangs out with who he wants to hang out with, sleeps with who he wants to sleep with, spends money on what he wants to spend money on. He does things that dishonor and shame the father. So at this point in the story, here's what we have to understand. The younger son has disowned his dad, and he has shamed his dad. He has literally cut all ties with his dad at this point in the story. But then it actually gets worse. Verse 14. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. Pause there, and let's think about this for a second. I have to think that the outwardly religious that were listening to this story probably at this point think, oh, dang, he finally got what he deserved. This is awesome. But here's the thing I want us to think about that hopefully gets a little uncomfortable. How often when you see someone do something obviously wrong in culture and they get caught and they get punished, how often do we think, man, they're getting what they deserve? How much are we more concerned with people getting what they deserve than getting them back to God? Food for thought. Let's keep reading. Verse 15, the son sinks lower. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him into his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. And in our day and in our culture, it's hard for us to grasp just how bad a deal this was for the younger son. See, because Jewish people considered pigs to be unclean. So if you touched a pig, if you worked with pigs, you couldn't go to the temple, you couldn't worship God. You were considered now detestable to God. And so to go and not only work for a Gentile who Jews hated, a Gentile is not a Jew, and to feed his pigs, this was as low as you could get for a Jewish person. So here's where we are in the story now. The younger son has disowned his dad. He has intentionally gone and separated himself from his dad. He has shamed his dad by going and doing things that the dad hates. And then when all hell breaks loose in his life and he hits rock bottom, instead of going to his dad, he tries to go and make some money feeding pigs. This is a detestable, awful fate for a Jewish person. And at this point in the story, most of the religious leaders listening would have thought, man, for this kid, there's no way back. He has gone way too far. He has disowned his family. He has shamed his family. There is no way that he would ever come back. There's no way, let's understand the context of the story. There's no way that God would ever take obviously rebellious people back. This is a cultural thinking, and so it would be surprising when Jesus said this, verse 17, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. At this point, the religious leaders are probably thinking, yeah, right. The father, no dad would take back an obviously rebellious son. In fact, in Deuteronomy, in one of the first 5 books of the Bible, what the Jews considered the law, the prescription for a rebellious son was not welcome him back, it was stone him to death. And some of you teenagers think you have it bad when your phone gets taken away. Y'all don't have it bad. And so the idea that this son could go back to his dad and even be a servant, they would be thinking, no, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is he's going to go back and he's going to get what's coming to him. He's going to get stoned to death. He's going to get punished because that's how God treats rebellious people. He doesn't welcome them back. He's out to get them. This was the popular thinking in Jewish religious thought at the time, but let's be honest, it's not too unlike our thinking in Southern Bible Belt culture often. Because often the mindset in Southern Bible Belt culture, and maybe some of you grew up with this, and maybe for some of you this is why you didn't come to church for a really, really long time, maybe it's why you haven't come to Jesus yet, it was this thought that God doesn't love me, God is out to get me because I've done really bad things. I'll give you a story to illustrate this. A couple months ago, my wife was going to my sister's baby shower, and I heard a knock on the door. It was a Saturday, and so I go and peer through the glass because I'm not just going to open the door without knowing who it is. And it's a guy with a suit and tie. So my first thought was this: awesome, it's Jehovah's Witness. I'm going to get, like this is going to be fun. And so I go and I grab my Bible and I go to the door and I open it and I'm like, can I help you? And he's like, hey, I'm a vacuum cleaner salesman. And my first thought was, well, that's disappointing. Like my heart kind of sank a little bit. It's like, well, this isn't going to be very fun. But then he said, can I come and do a demonstration in your house and you'll get something free out of it? And then my hopes renewed. I was like, well, free is good. It was a little bit of a letdown because it was dish soap. So that wasn't really the free I was hoping for. But I had the thought, this can still work because he's going to come into my house and I'm going to share Jesus with him. And he can't say anything nasty because he has to be nice because he's trying to sell me a vastly overpriced vacuum cleaner. So after him talking for like an hour, and like I was honestly starting to get worried. I was like, this guy keeps talking. I have no way to get like Jesus into the conversation. And then he finally asked me what I did, and I was like, yes. And I told him I was a pastor, which I usually don't volunteer that information because usually things get weird. People either start acting really religious or they're like, what does the Bible say about aliens? And I'm like, I don't. No, so I usually don't volunteer that I'm a pastor unless somebody directly asks. But in this case, it was good. It was like, great, I can have a spiritual conversation with him. And I did, and he started opening up a little bit. And he started talking about his sister. And then he said something that really, really broke my heart. He said, my sister's had a really rough life, and she believes that she's had a rough life because when she was a teenager, she had an abortion. Translation, she did something God didn't want her to do, and so she believes that God's now out to get her. And that's probably not an idea she came up with on her own. That was probably an idea that was communicated to her either directly or indirectly. Most likely from church people. So this mindset that God doesn't want anything to do with obviously rebellious sinners, this is not something relegated to the first century. This is something that comes up in our culture, in our time, it's this idea that, you know what, if I don't drink, smoke, and chew, or run with girls and guys who do, if I'm not cheating on my spouse, if I'm not getting high, if I'm not getting wasted every weekend, if I pay my taxes and tithe 10.5% because that makes me really, really godly, then God likes me and God is pleased with me. But for the guy who's been divorced and for the girl who's had an abortion and for the young man who struggles with gender identity, oh, God doesn't love those people. God's out to get those people. This is what we often think of as what God looks at us like when we're sinful. And this is what the religious group thought that God looked at sinners like. But then Jesus takes the story in a different direction, and it shows a drastically different picture of God. Verse 20 says this: So he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. Y'all, this would have been scandalous. Because first off, in Jewish culture, like elderly men did not run. It was considered undignified. And they most certainly did not wrap their arms around a kid who was rebellious. They most certainly did not kiss a rebellious kid who had been feeding pigs. They would have been like, okay, we're going to take you to the woodshed and we're going to take care of business. And in the Jewish religious leader's mindset, what makes this even more shocking is the fact that the dad represents God. And for them, they're like, no. This is not the way this works. God does not run to sinners. God does not embrace sinners. God does not welcome sinners back. God's out to get them. So this would have been shocking to the listeners of the audience. And then the son goes on his speech. Verse 21, the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. This is a drastically different picture of God than one that we tend to often have. This is a drastically different picture of God than the religious leaders had. This is not a God who is out to get sinners. This is a God who wants to welcome broken, wicked, sinful people back into his home. And it's not that he's just waiting there with the door open. It's actually something that goes beyond that. And we find it in this phrase in this verse. You can write this down. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. Let me ask you this. How could it be that the father saw him? It's because he was looking for him. He was looking for him. The father wasn't pent up in his house thinking, well, maybe my kid will come home someday. He's actually out with his eyes on the road looking for his rebellious child. And he's not waiting for him to come home so he can give him a whooping. He's waiting for him to come home so he can embrace him in his arms and bring him back into the home. Which leads me to this. The father seeks those far from him. The father seeks those far from him. This can tend to maybe create a disconnect for us because all of us have people who maybe we were close to at one point and then distance happened. Like if you graduated high school or maybe you didn't, that's okay. But you left high school at one point. Well, like here's what happens in high school, and teenagers listen to me on this. This is like a practical tidbit for you. You're always like, we're always going to be close for our whole lives. Wrong. The day after you graduate, you will not see like 99% of those people ever again. Ever. Praise God for that too. Because there's some guys and girls you're going to date that you're going to be like, I don't want to see them again. But a point in that, I know I say this a lot, teenagers, but the point in that is this. Man, please don't waste your teenage years trying to impress people that the day after you graduate, you'll never see the vast majority of them ever again. So, for example, once you graduate high school, you get disconnected from people. You don't talk to them. Like the vast majority of folks I graduate with, I don't talk to them. It's not because I dislike them. It's just because, we just don't connect anymore. I've got a couple guys I went to school with that we talk a lot and all that. So I talk to the guys that are kind of close with me, but guys that were disconnected from me, I don't really talk with them anymore. And that makes sense. But what makes even more sense is if there was some drama between you and this person, you and this guy, you and this girl in high school, and you left and there's bad blood there, like Taylor Swift wrote a song about, which you shouldn't listen to because her music is terrible. That's just my opinion. I'm free to be wrong. If you like it, it's not a knock on you. But like for that person, the thought is, I would never go out and try to have a conversation with them. I would never go and pursue them. I would never go and hang out with them. Why? Because you're enemies. Like there's not a relationship there. There's a disconnect there, which makes this pursuit by God of lost people such a big deal, because it's not that God pursues us because we're awesome. We suck. In fact, Scripture even describes us as objects of God's wrath, enemies of God, and yet God still pursues us. God still invites us to come home. God still seeks us. That's part of what Christmas is all about. Jesus coming to earth is such a big deal. It's not just so we can put him in a manger and sing Christmas carols and have trees, and you should have a Christmas tree and a live one because they're a lot of fun. They're way better than artificial trees. But Jesus coming to earth is this beautiful picture of perfect, holy God coming and pursuing people who are not just kind of, there's a bit of a disconnect, people who are his enemies. And he seeks them. And it doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how far you've run from God. It doesn't matter how much you've screwed up your life or the life of somebody else. God still pursues you. The idea that, I've done way too much awful stuff, God would never want me. God's actually pursuing you. He's looking for you, and he invites you back home. It doesn't matter how rebellious you've been. The arms of the Father are still open. But here's the deal. And I think this might be even more important for our current context, at least for some of us in this room. It's not just the obviously rebellious that are lost and that the Father is seeking. It's also the outwardly religious. Which turns our attention to the story of the older son. Here we go. Remember, the older son represents the religious leaders, the Pharisees, Sadducees, these guys that were outwardly religious, but what we're going to find out in a second is they were just as distant from the heart of the Father as the obviously rebellious son. But we're also going to see that just like the Father sought and pursued the younger son, he actually also seeks and pursues the older son. Watch this. Verse 25, meanwhile, the older son was in the field. This is the first indication that we know his heart was distant from the Father. You might say, why? But because instead of seeking what the Father sought, he was actually out just trying to do work. Here's a really clear indication that you might be outwardly religious, but you've never stepped into a relationship with Christ. Does your heart beat for people that are obviously lost? Or when you think of somebody who you perceive as maybe not as good as you, is your thought, I can't wait till they get what's coming to them. I can't wait for Judgment Day because they're going to get it. How do you respond to people who are obviously lost? And in fact, here's a great picture of it, the rest of the story of the older son. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied. Your father has killed the fattened calf. They're having veal up in this house. Veal parmesan with mozzarella cheese. It's fantastic. Because he has him back safe and sound. Then verse 28, the older brother got angry and refused to go in. This is not surprising to us. Because how many of y'all have siblings? Show hands, show hands, show hands. How many of y'all have ever seen your sibling do something and then you thought they got off the hook? Yes, like I have a younger sister. She's awesome, way smarter than me. But when my brother and I were kids, we always felt like my sister got off the hook way more than we did. And it didn't make us feel warm fuzzy. It was like, it just made us angry. And that's how you felt towards your sibling. So the feelings of the older brother are understandable here because he's like, time out, time out. You mean to tell me that this son of my dad, in fact, we're going to see he doesn't even call him his brother. You mean to tell me the guy who took his money and wasted it all in Vegas, the guy who's gone and done all these things that my dad hates, the guy that has disowned our family, you mean instead of dad giving him a whipping, you mean to tell me that dad's throwing a party for him? Are you kidding me? So I think we can understand like the anger here and the aggravation, but in the context of the story, if he had had the heart of the father, he would have been happy that his younger son had come home. Because the father, more than anything, wants people that are far from him to come home to him. But the fact that his heart instead reacts in anger indicates that man, he's just outwardly religious. He doesn't want what God wants. He doesn't want what the Father wants. He's just obsessed with doing his little religious thing. But then this is really cool. Watch this. It said, so his father went out and pleaded with him. That's a big deal. That's a big deal because especially when we start talking about God pursuing lost people, a lot of the times, and in fact, it's somewhat fashionable for churches to even hate on like religious hypocrites. And you can almost get the impression, if you're not really, really careful, that the gospel is for people who are obviously lost, but it's not for the religious hypocrite. Here's what we need to understand. The gospel is for the religious hypocrite, the outwardly religious person, just as much as it is for the obviously rebellious person. We have to understand that. Because see, here's the thing. If you have a story where you were far from God and God brought you back, please don't start looking down your nose at religious hypocrites, even if they turned you off from church. Because they're probably just as lost as you were, and they need the same gospel you do. And guess what? The father pursued the older son just like he pursued the younger son. And then so the older son responds here. It's somewhat predictable, but it says verse 29, he answered his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. And I've never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. This is like the older son tongue lashing the dad because he's like, you gave him something he didn't deserve. But see, here's the other thing that we have to back up because part of this critique of the father is just very, very inaccurate because you'll remember that the dad had already completely dispersed his estate. You remember that from the beginning of the story? And so for the older son to say, you never even gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends, was just not true because reality was the father had already given the older son everything that was left over. So if he'd wanted to go and have filet every night, he could have had filet every night. If he had wanted to hire someone to go work in the fields so he could help his dad look for his younger son, he could have done that, but he chose not to do it. And he chose not to do it because he was outwardly religious. And outwardly religious people are just as lost as obviously rebellious people, even though it looks different. An obviously rebellious person, and maybe that describes you in here this morning, this is one who says, God, I do not want you in my life. I don't want anything to do with you. I want to do what I want to do, and I'm just not interested. But the outwardly religious person is like the older brother there in the field saying, God, if I do all this stuff, that's what makes you happy with me, and that's what makes me in good standing with you. And it's just as far from God as the obviously rebellious person. Because the only thing that gets you to God is not your religion. And in fact, I also think it's interesting. We'll bring this out at Christmas especially. You'll note that the first thing the younger son does when he gets back to the dad is he's like, hey, Dad, can I start working for you? Because religion is often the first place we tend to turn. But what makes you good with God is not religion. It's not you saying a lot of prayers. It's not you serving at church. It's not you tithing. It's not you doing religious things like reading your Bible and praying. The only thing that makes you right with God is Jesus Christ. And the only way you can stand before God and have a relationship with Him is by receiving the forgiveness of sins that Jesus purchased on your behalf. That's the only way you can be good with God. And He offers that to both the outwardly religious and the obviously rebellious. And this is so cool. He keeps pursuing the older son here, verse 31. My son, the father said, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. Translation, hey, I'm not here to lecture you. Just like I didn't come out to lecture the younger son, but to invite him in. All I'm doing here is saying, hey, son, come back inside, come back home, come back into the family. It's the same heart that led the dad to pursue the younger son that leads him to go to the older son and extend an invitation. And then he says this. He says, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Translation, I understand you may not like it, but at the end of the day, we're going to celebrate your brother coming back home. And the fact is, if the older son had come back home as well, he would have been a part of the party. Which leads me to this, write this down. God values people who are far from Him coming home to Him. God values people who are far from Him coming home to Him. So we have to ask this question, and I think, and the way we answer this question is going to determine how effective we are as a church. But do we have placed the same value on people far from God coming home to God that God does? The most dangerous place we can ever get as a church is when we value the things we do together as a church more than we do the mission of God and reaching people far from Him. What has decimated the church has been placing a bigger value on buildings and budgets and programs and the color of the carpet than the person that is running from God or the person that is lost and outwardly religious and far from God. There is nothing that we can ever put in the place of reaching lost people, whether they are obviously rebellious or outwardly religious, because that's why Jesus started the church. The Great Commission, Matthew 28:19-20, go and make disciples. The mission of the church is go and make disciples. The mission of the church is not gather on Sunday morning and do Christian things. The mission of the church is reach people and bring them into the family of God. So is that what our heart beats for? It has to be. Because if it's not, man, we might as well close up shop and go figure out something else. Because if our heart is not beating for what the Father's heart is beating for, as a church and as individuals, man, we're missing it. So with that in mind, there's three questions I want us to work through here to get us into this posture of valuing what the Father values. And I believe in so many ways, like this, and I don't think this is an exaggeration. I think the way we respond to this message will determine the course of our church. I really, really do believe that. It's that important because it so connects with the heart of God. So three questions. Here we go. Number one, will I see the people distant from God around me? Will I see the people distant from God around me? In the story here, the father notices the younger son is gone. He notices the older son is not in the room. He sees them. He notices their absence. So the question is, do we see the people that are distant from God around us? And often the question is usually no. And the reason would be no, because we're simply not looking for them. Because you don't notice things you're not looking for. For example, I'm not the most observant person in the world. I'm just not. And so if I like am riding down the road and you're like, I waved at you, I probably didn't see you because I'm just not observant. So a couple years ago, my wife and I are on a walk. And we go by a house in our neighborhood, and it's about this time. And I'm like, dude, they've got their Christmas decorations up already. And I thought that was cool. And then Grace said, they've been up for 2 weeks. And I was like, no. That's not the case. And she's like, yes, they've been up for 2 weeks. And I was like, really? I'm just not an observant guy. I just am not. But I'm not observant for things that I'm not looking for. And the same thing is true when it comes to how we interact with people that are far from God, whether they're obviously rebellious or outwardly religious. If you're not looking for them, it's hard to notice them. And the fact is, y'all, they are everywhere. They are everywhere. Matt Gilley talked about last week that there are 50,000 lost, and that's probably a low estimate because when you look at census data, that when there's like a number that is like religious, then that's people who go to church. That's not necessarily people who actually have a relationship with Christ. So 50,000 is actually probably the minimum number of people who are lost, and if they die, they would go to hell in 10 miles, 10-mile radius of Smithfield. Can we let that sink in for a second? 50,000 people within 10 miles of here. It's a lot of people. They are everywhere. They're all around you at the grocery store, at the post office, at Starbucks, when you're out on a walk. They are everywhere. They're probably your neighbors. But are we opening our eyes and seeing that? And I'll tell you really how you can open your eyes and see Him is start putting your eyes on God, because when you start putting your eyes on God, He tends to direct your eyes to the things He wants you to see. So I think the reality is the reason we don't notice lost people often is because we actually don't notice God often. Because when your eyes aren't looking at God, it's kind of hard for Him to direct your attention to the right things. So that's probably the first place we need to start, is to get our eyes back on God. Get in His Word, get in prayer. And then as you get close to God, He'll start to change your heart to where you want to participate in His mission. He'll open your eyes to where you can see the need in front of you. And then it has to lead to this. Question number 2, will I run to them? Will I run to them? The father in the story doesn't just notice the younger son. He doesn't just notice the lostness of the older son. He pursues them. He goes to them. So much so that he runs to them, to the younger one anyway. So, do we run to lost people? Do we seek lost people? You say, well, how do you do that? Do you go to places where you know they're going to be? Well, I have to preach this to myself more than anybody else, because, y'all, it is so easy for me to get in a Christian bubble. I'm a pastor. I work with Christians. I'm around Christians all the time. If I'm not super intentional about creating some opportunities to interact with lost people, I will never interact with a lost person. It would be really easy to never do that. So are you going to the places where lost people are? Are you creating opportunities to reach lost people? It is really, really hard to fulfill the Great Commission if you have no people that you are at least acquainted with that are lost. Well, like if you can't answer, if I was to ask you the question, who's somebody that you know who doesn't go to church and therefore is most likely lost, because that's usually an easy way to tell, who is that person that you know and that you're inviting? If there's like some squirming there, you don't really know, then can I just say this in love? You're missing something. And I know a lot of times the pushback is, well, I don't want to be around a bad influence. Then go and be an influencer. And stop letting culture dictate the way you think and the way you live, and you go set the temperature. That's what God wants the church to do. Is not be influenced by the culture, but go and permeate the culture and influence. That Jesus did not ever tell the church to get behind the four walls of the church and build up walls and make sure the defenses are barricaded so we can wait until He comes back. He told us to go out into the world and run to lost people. So will you run to them? Which, by the way, again, this is what Jesus did for us at Christmas. By coming to earth. He didn't sit up in heaven and say, well, I guess we can maybe reach Him from here. He said, I'm going to go to them. Which, if you're here and you're not a follower of Jesus, Jesus runs to you. By the way, even though you run from Him and you can't outrun Him. So will you run to them? Will we run to them? Then question number 3, will I embrace them? Will I embrace them? Much like the dad does with both sons. With the younger son, he throws his arms around them. Despite all the muck, despite all the mess, he wraps his arms around him. For the older son, he goes out and he doesn't say, son, you're being a moron. He calls him my son. He embraces them. He identifies with them. Will we identify? Will we embrace lost people? That's why one of the things we like to say around here is you can belong with us before you believe like us. And sometimes that, and the reality is that's going to get uncomfortable at times, especially if they don't look like you, especially if they do things that you don't approve of. In fact, let's run through a few of them. When we talk about embracing lost people, like welcoming them into our home, like in our life groups, welcoming them into here, not shunning them, but sitting with them and building a relationship with them. That's awesome to talk about in theory. But teenagers, what about if your daughter wants to bring her friend who got pregnant? Is that okay? Because sometimes parents freak out. They're like, well, you can't hang around her. She's a bad influence. You're literally abandoning that young lady in her biggest time of need. Is it okay to bring a girl here who's pregnant? Is it okay to bring a guy here who's gay and his gay boyfriend? Is that okay? And sit next to them and shake their hand? When they walk up holding hands, is it okay to say, hey, we're glad you're here? Or does that make you cringe a little bit? Is it okay to welcome the young lady who struggles with gender identity and thinks she's a boy? Can we embrace her? Can we embrace the girl who's had an abortion? Can we embrace the woman who's been divorced 4 times? Can we embrace lost people who are a different skin color than you are, than I am? Can we do that? Because if any of that makes you uncomfortable, I would just submit to you, you need to grow deeper in the grace of the gospel. Let me ask you this. This will be really uncomfortable, especially since it's relevant. What if by some chance this guy they arrested, this live-in boyfriend that most likely killed this young 3-year-old, what if by some chance they let him off and he showed up here? Would that be okay? Would that be okay? Would we be like, yes, come in here and hear the gospel? Or we'd be like, no, you can't hear this. This is not for you. You've done too much. Y'all, God's grace is scandalous. God's grace goes way further than you and I can ever possibly fathom. And if it bothers us to embrace and welcome people who make us uncomfortable, y'all, we've got some serious growth to do in the gospel. Because the same gospel, and here's where so much of this wrong thinking comes from. It comes in thinking that we're somehow less of a sinner than other people are. You do realize that even the smallest amount of sin is like spitting in the face of God and flipping the bird. The smallest amount of sin. That time you cussed when somebody cut you off, hey, you know what? You might as well kill Jesus right there. Because that put him on a cross. The ground is level at the foot of the cross, y'all. It's level. And there's nobody better than anybody else. So when you've been saved, the goal is not to distance yourself from sinners. It's to see them. It's to run to them. And it's to embrace them. By the way, you know Jesus embraced every ounce of who we were. Because he didn't come to earth as a conquering king. He came and fully wrapped himself in humanity. And he didn't come born in a king's palace as royalty. He came born with the smell of animal manure and animal urine all around him in a feeding trough. He didn't go live in the most popular city. He didn't go grow up in Rome. He grew up on the backside of Nazareth, which was like it was a town with a very, very negative reputation. And did you know when he was baptized, you know what was the big deal about that was? That was him saying to his father and everybody else, I'm one of them. He identified with us. He didn't keep himself distant from us. He embraced us, and then he embraced the death that we should have died. Like you do realize when he went to the cross, that was in your place. Your place. You should have been there. And yet he went there. And if Jesus did that for us, if he came to us as a baby and wrapped himself in humanity, embraced humanity, then man, that has to be our heart towards people that are far from God, whether they are obviously rebellious or if they are outwardly religious. That has to be our heart because it's the heart of God. And here's what will happen when that happens. Celebration. So when we get in line with the heart of God and we pursue people who are far from God, people who are distant from God, whether they are obviously rebellious or whether they're outwardly religious, here's what I believe happens. I believe the gospel is the power of God to save people. When the gospel is preached, when the gospel is proclaimed, people get saved and heaven throws a party. And y'all, this is why we do a Christmas experience. We're not doing a Christmas experience in less than 3 weeks because we just want to come and have a fun time and do some Christian things, and it's kind of a tradition around the holidays. We're not doing that for that reason. We're doing a Christmas experience because the simple fact is lost people are more likely to show up at Christmas than any other time during the year. And we want to create an opportunity for me and for you to invite lost people to come here, because the most important thing that'll happen is this. The gospel's going to be preached that night. They're going to be given a chance to respond, and I believe we're going to see celebration happen, because I believe we're going to see lost people come